This is the third part from the book The Way of Transformation by Karl Fried Durkheim von Graf. And this third part is very long, so I might not finish it this one time, so I might have to break it up in little parts. But here it is. It's called The Wheel of Transformation. It is impossible for man to achieve self-realization as a person unless he is prepared fully to cooperate in the process. At each step, this process depends on man's wholehearted concurrence, for in the long run, self-realization can only be the result of his constant and tireless practice. Not until a man has begun to practice continuously with complete awareness can he be said, really, to have joined the way. From then on, the wheel of transformation never stops turning. Or if it does stop, it topples over and man becomes stuck fast and is unable to move. The process of transformation consists of 3 stages. 1. All that is contrary to essential being must be relinquished. 2. That which has been relinquished must be dissolved in the ground of being, which absorbs, redeems, transforms, and recreates. 3. The newly formed core which arises out of the ground of being must be recognized, accepted, allowed to grow, and personal responsibility for it undertaken. Further, since that which conflicts with essential being must first be discerned in order that it may be relinquished, so the newly formed core must be assented to by the will in order that it may ultimately be realized and made effectual in life, reintegration with the world ego, or reintegration with the world ego. To this end, it may be said that the wheel of transformation has 5 spokes or steps. 1. The practice of critical awareness. 2. The letting go of all that stands in the way of new becoming. 3. Union with the ground of being. 4. New becoming in accordance with the inner image which has arisen from the ground of being. And 5. Putting to the test this new form, practicing it in everyday life and noting all failures by means of critical awareness. And so, the wheel turns. Each section of the revolving wheel serves, in its own way, to create an attitude that enables man to grow more and more transparent to divine being. To achieve this, no step may be omitted. Each one, if it is truly accomplished, contains all the others. Yet, each has its own specific purpose. Here, it should be said that it is helpful for the beginner, and which of us does not remain a beginner throughout his life, to lay special emphasis in his daily life or in set periods of practice, sometimes on one step, sometimes on another. The essential thing to remember, however, is that transformation is only possible so long as the wheel is kept turning. The steps have their use and meaning only within the context of the continuously revolving wheel. One isolated experience of divine being when in some unique moment we are possessed by feelings of liberation and responsibility is, of itself, never enough to give us the strength to keep the wheel in motion. It is essential that we recognize and repeatedly grasp anew the proper purpose of such experiences, which is to bear witness to divine being in the midst of our life in the world. Further, we must strive for the fulfillment of this purpose by repeatedly affirming our decision. rooting it firmly in our conscience and absorbing it into our will. Only from fidelity to this process of ceaselessness, only from fidelity to this process of ceaseless transformation can critical awareness, letting go, union, new becoming, and our testimony to these in daily life be existentially valid. 1. Critical awareness. Critical awareness bears upon all that obstructs our contact and integration with essential being, as well as all that stands in the way of true realization. Critical awareness is not a state of mind which can be reached once and for all, without further effort. It is a continuing process which has, as its aim, the growth of consciousness. It is not to be confused with a purely intellectual faculty, but is, rather, an inner awareness, an inner knowing, indeed, a transforming power. For instance, to take cognizance intellectually of the fact that there is a contradiction in what we think of as the ideal image is not at all the same thing as becoming inwardly aware of a wrong attitude. The latter process is, rather, an inward sensing of the way in which a person, where rightly or wrongly present, that is in harmony with our antagonistic or to our true nature. This sensing grows more acute the more completely we are committed to following the way, to living in accordance with essential being, and to obeying our inner law. The creative and transforming power of critical awareness develops out of an inner awareness of the body, and not from some rational conception of what we believe corresponds to or conflicts with correct posture. For this reason, transformation begins only after the necessary attitude has been inwardly experienced. Thus, we find that in order to be effective, our orientation towards the divine and its manifestation, which should be the foundation of all other actions, requires far more than the conceiving of an ideal image and systematically striving towards it. It is not until we comprehend our inner structure that such orientation effectually begins to permeate all bodily movements. Only by means of a continuous single minded effort can this process, in the long run, either bring about transformation or exclude all that stands in the way of such permeability. With regard to the development of critical self awareness, what element in it should we consider most important to practice? It is the awakening of, the separating out, and, as it were, the making articulate a new sense that can smell out inner truth. Such work requires the development of a sensitivity which will enable us reliably to perceive all deviations from the true inner order. In particular, we need to become suc- in particular, we need to become susceptible to that within us which knows beyond any doubt whether we are wrongly or rightly centered. In this way, critical awareness, being the means by which we progress, becomes active in each aim and aspect of a man's life. Through it, we come to understand that which is required is the development of a new kind of sensitivity which will enable us to sense the correct center and to become aware of all deviations from it. Few people, in these days, have any feelings for or understanding of the right center, even though there may be considerable technical knowledge available about right and wrong posture. Being correctly centered does not mean merely that a man is so anchored in some central part of himself that he can, from that solid position, confidently confront the world. This is not enough. The right center is that which enables us to correspond to essential being. Once a man has been truly seized by essential being and undergone the transformation that results from such an experience, his life will henceforth revolve around his determination to attain, preserve, or re-establish that state of mind and body which can remain permeable to essential being. This revolution around the true center begins only when man is able to sustain the proper inward attitude without slackening. All distortion and loss of the correct physical form, that form through which man is intended to fulfill his life, is connected with the absence of the right center. But what do we mean by the term center? In relation to what consciousness, which sees reality solely in the context of things, the word center has merely a spatial or physical meaning. For the who consciousness, however, being centered signifies a state of wherein a man moves continuously towards his innermost nature. That is to say, his aim is centered in his essential mission, which is to manifest being in the world. The opposite of such an attitude would be one where a man is exclusively oriented towards worldly values and whose life revolves wholly around the desires of his world ego. In other words, center, from a rational point of view, refers to a fixed point. In its personal meaning, however, the center is the center of our individual life, our driving force, reason, and purpose. Understood in this personal sense, the word center has a threefold foundation. It stands on the strength by which we live, the meaning around which we revolve, and the fulfillment for which we search. Inevitably, man's life is focused and nourished by a specific vital force, by search for individual meaning, and by a longing for personal fulfillment. Strength, meaning, and fulfillment, however, have a different significance according to whether a man identifies himself with his world ego or with his essential being. Strength, from the standpoint of the world ego, is a quality which enables man to survive healthily and efficiently in the world, meaning may grow out of any kind of work, including service to the community, that is valid in and recognized by the world. Fulfillment is brought about by whatever finally sets the mind at rest. When, however, man is identified with his essential being, strength is the result of contact with essential being, meaning derives from obedience to the requirements of essential being, and once he joins the way of becoming transparent, fulfillment is at hand. In a state of identification with his ego, man is dependent on the world. He needs the world and relies upon it to give himself meaning. The development and functioning of his worldly strength, as well as his self-confidence and ability to survive, are conditioned on all sides by external factors. Under such conditions, he is liable to be easily upset, touchy, quick to feel aggrieved, and always on the lookout for security. He sways backwards and forwards between states of restriction and abandonment, hypertension and dissolution, elevation and prostration. He experiences every condition except that of being firmly balanced. Why is this? The explanation is to be found in his lack of a center capable of supporting him, a center which cannot be shaken. Once a man is anchored in his essential being, he becomes aware that there exists in him a core that nothing can destroy. From this, he gains stability and permanence. He acquires a composure. He acquires a composure that is independent of the world, a clear sense of his inner direction, and above all, a self-confidence that is independent of the world's praise or blame. The personal significance of being centered is that a man can so live in the midst of all the ups and downs of life that he receives strength, purpose, and direction from essential being. Imperturbable and at peace, he ceaselessly pursues his inner destiny and so manifests divine being in his life in the world. Stretched as he is between heaven and earth, man's spiritual development and the possibility that essential being will reveal itself to him, depending, in the first instance, on his being correctly anchored in the earth. In other words, he has first to discover his right center of gravity. Understood in the personal sense, center of gravity does not refer to any specific area, but to what we may call the root of personal or existential life. Nevertheless, it is possible to perceive whether or not a person is properly rooted in his physical body. When a man has found this correct center of gravity in his body, he can open himself to the forces that lie at the essential core of life and anchored himself therein. The vital of or earth center of man contains all the energies of the ground of being, energies that bring to his aid a sense of liberation, a strong inner support and the possibility of regeneration. When he is relaxed and firmly based in this center, man experiences these forces in his physical existence. He immediately loses them, however, when he draws himself up tensely, for such a movement cuts him off from the life-giving strength from below. The center of gravity is thus misplaced. Worse still, it can happen that no center of gravity exists at all, except perhaps for a fleeting moment, in which case hypertension or dissolution are the result. It is the center of gravity which determines the total posture of the body, as well as its patterns of tension and the character of its breathing. That power which enables us to be truly centered lies physically in the middle of the body in hara, or more accurately, in the pelvic region. Note, see Durkheim, Hara, The Vital Center of Man, Allen and Unwin. Hara, or Japanese for belly, refers to an attitude by means of which man is anchored below in such a way that he is freed from habitual restrictions brought about by being top heavily centered above in his world ego. This settling down into himself below, this reorientation of body and soul, allow the strength within man's own being to support and mold him and to give direction to his life. A man may have an incorrect center of gravity or even none at all, and in either case, this is a result of the extent and dimension of his world ego, which is to say that he has either too much of this or too little. The more he identifies with this ego, the higher up in his body will be his point of anchorage. Caught thus in these extremes of the ego, his attitude will be determined by his intellect or head, his will, chest, or his all too sensitive feelings, heart. Thus, drawn up, tense and rigid, he will be totally at war with his instinctive drives and cut off from cosmic forces. If, on the other hand, a man's ego is underdeveloped, the connection to the center from which strength and form are derived may be almost completely lacking. As a result, he will fall apart or collapse and become the plaything of inner and outer forces. He will be unable to be true to himself or to stand up to the world as a person. Thus, we see that when the center of gravity has become fixed too far upwards in the body, Man is cut off from the ground of being, as well as from the liberating and supporting power of his own essential being, and thus is trapped in all the menace and terror of the world. When, on the other hand, he has no center of gravity at all, even a minimum amount of self possession will be lacking. He will have no means of receiving the incoming stream of divine being, since he has not developed that inherent form through which he could give it entrance and pour it out again in his work in the world. The core of the practice of pure gesture lies in learning to anchor the whole of ourselves in the correct center of gravity. It is vital to awaken within ourselves an innate feeling for the true earth center. This should be our constant practice so that, with the help of critical awareness, we may bear witness to it in our lives. No matter how manifold nor how complex the manifestations of the earth center may be, it never ceases to summon us and entreat. If we are prepared to listen faithfully, we will constantly hear its call. It rings out with equal felicity and promise, no matter what the situation, in conditions of joy or grief, dearth or excess, and in the warning voice of conscience that cries aloud to us when we lose sight of our inner destiny. With its, as we have already seen, the counterpart of a wrong or a non existent center of gravity is a tendency towards hypertension, with its inevitable compensation, dissolution. Hypertension is an indication that the attention is predominantly concerned with seeking to consolidate a particular position. This kind of fixed attention will never relax its hold while man is held fast by his ego. Every type of hypertension, every kind of contradiction, every kind of contraction is an expression of lack of trust and reveals, whether actively or passively, attitudes of self protection or resistance. Such attitudes cannot, therefore, be corrected by purely technical means. Only long practice of the fundamental gesture of truthfulness serves any purpose here. Hypertension always goes hand in hand, as it were, with a kind of shallow breathing that takes place in the upper part of the body. This of itself is sufficient evidence of a man's imprisonment in the ego. It lacks the calmness and composure which distinguishes one who, being rightly centered, is in direct contact with being. Here, critical awareness proves its value with its capacity for sensing the wrong center of gravity, incorrect tension, and inharmonious breathing. It is important that this sensing of the center of gravity, tension, and breathing should not be thought of or practiced in any rational way, but understood rather as an inward and personal attitude. Only thus can it serve as a means of fulfilling man's basic inner law, which requires him to be permeable to divine being and to live from his essence in his own particular form. By the ability to sense what is incorrect, as well as to establish what is correct, will only be present if the larger existential search has already begun. As long as a man, although able theoretically to recognize what would be for him the correct state of being, still thinks in terms of the desires and anxieties of his ego, seeking freedom, comfort, or security with his rational understanding, he will not be able to perceive the personal significance either of the center of gravity or of tension and breathing. Under such conditions, he will reason solely in physical terms. He will tackle wrong posture in a purely technical way, attempting to correct it simply as a pragmatic necessity. For the sake of his health and efficiency, in addition, he will mistake the practice of establishing the right center and the firm anchoring in the pelvic region for some physical trick that will be of use to his world ego. In such a case, the practice of the right center, of stillness, and of relaxation, if carried out merely for the sake of easing the mind, will turn into the opposite of what was intended. It will become the means for enabling man temporarily to retain his wrong posture and attitudes without discomfort, and thus to remain caught in the ego, which by its nature unfailingly tries to turn its back on suffering. The practice that relates to being is quite different. It makes it possible for man to risk himself courageously, frees him from his fear of the world, and, through his acceptance and endurance of the harshest tests, enables him to remain on the way of transformation. On the other hand, wrong practice will always keep him at a distance from divine being. The end of Part 3 from the book The Wheel of Transformation, called The Wheel of Transformation, called Point 1, Critical Awareness. I will continue more some other time with Point 2.